Well, except there were 4 years of living in the nearest Holiday Inn was my address, you know. Now I got a home.
You like that?
Sure.
Oh, honey, when I met you, you were living with your parents.
But this is his own home.
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
Stop scrolling just for a second. Because what I'm about to tell you is not the version of Eddie Van Halen that most people know. Not the godlike guitar hero. Not the guy who made your jaw drop every single time you touched a fretboard. I mean, yeah, all of that is true. But behind all of it, there was a storm. A long, ugly, complicated storm that lasted decades and left real people with real scars. And here's the thing that got me. The people who paid the heaviest price for Eddie's genius weren't his enemies. They were the people who loved him most. This is Hidden Fame Files, and today we are going deep, real deep. So grab your drink, get comfortable, because this one does not hold back. Let's set the stage first, because you need to understand just how big Van Halen was. We're not talking about a successful rock band. We're talking about a band that literally changed the entire direction of rock guitar overnight. When their debut album dropped in 1978, guitarists across the world stopped what they were doing and went, wait, what just happened? Eddie Van Halen didn't just play guitar, he redefined what guitar could be. Two-handed tapping, insane speed, this warm, almost liquid tone that nobody had heard before. There's a reason musicians called Eruption, that famous solo, one of the most important guitar moments in history, and it's only 1 minute and 42 seconds long. But here's what the legend glosses over. The man behind that genius was carrying a whole lot of weight. Personal demons, toxic relationships, and a pattern of behavior that, when you really look at it, hurt people he never should have hurt. So, let's talk about the first victim. And honestly, this one hits different. Michael Anthony. If you were a Van Halen fan back in the day, you know Michael Anthony. Big smile, insane high-pitched backing vocals, that Jack Daniels bass. The guy was the heartbeat of that band's live energy for years, from 1974 all the way through 2004. 3 decades. And in all that time, what did he get? Here's where it gets uncomfortable. At the height of Van Halen's fame, like stadium-selling, world-dominating fame, Michael Anthony was stripped of his equal ownership stake in the band. Royalties from songwriting largely cut off. The financial arrangements quietly shifted in a way that left Anthony on the outside looking in, while Eddie and Alex consolidated control. Now look, creative partnerships are messy. Eddie wrote the riffs, nobody's disputing that. But Michael Anthony was there from day one. He was part of the sound, part of the brotherhood, part of the image. And the way it was handled, people close to the band called it one of the most unfair things Eddie ever did. And here's what makes it even sadder. Anthony wasn't bitter about it publicly. He kept showing up, kept playing, kept being the professional. Even years later, after everything fell apart, he wasn't out there dragging Eddie's name through the mud. But I want you to think about that for a second. 30 years of loyalty, and in the end, he couldn't even reconcile with Eddie before he passed away in 2020. He told a podcast, and this genuinely got to me when I read it, that they had unresolved issues, and now those issues will never be resolved. How do you even sit with that? Drop a comment below. Would you have walked away sooner, or would you have stuck it out like Michael Anthony did? I genuinely want to know what you think. Now, let's talk about the relationship that basically defined Van Halen's chaos from the very beginning. David Lee Roth. Oh boy, where do we even start with this one? David Lee Roth was not just a frontman, he was a force. Tight pants, big hair, acrobatic kicks that had no business being that high off the ground for that long. The man was pure theater. And paired with Eddie's guitar wizardry, it was one of the greatest front-to-back combinations in rock history. But from very early on, there was friction, and not the productive kind. Eddie was a musician's musician. He wanted the music to be the thing. He'd spent hours, days in his studio, which he literally built in his backyard and called 5150, just obsessing over sounds and tones. The music was the point. Roth was the show. Roth was the persona. And as Van Halen got bigger and bigger, Roth got more and more interested in building the David Lee Roth brand separate from the band. The creative arguments got louder, the personality clashes got uglier, and by 1985, it was over. Roth left, or was pushed out depending on who you ask, and it sent shockwaves throughout the entire rock world. People thought that was the end of Van Halen, but Eddie, being Eddie, just kept going. Brought in Sammy Hagar, kept selling out arenas. But Roth, he never quite let it go, and neither did Eddie. For years, there was this low-level Cold War between them. Public shots, passive-aggressive interviews, the occasional almost reunion that fell apart almost immediately. And then Eddie died. And this is where it gets wild, because what happened after Eddie's death tells you almost everything you need to know about who David Lee Roth really is underneath the persona. Here's what we now know, thanks to Alex Van Halen finally opening up in late 2024. There were actual rehearsals for a reunion tour. They had a lineup taking shape. Joe Satriani on guitar, potentially Michael Anthony back on bass. It was real. It was happening. And then Alex brought up one simple idea. Hey, at some point during the tour, we should acknowledge Eddie. Honor him. The guy was our brother, our bandmate, the reason any of us are here. Reasonable, right? I mean, obviously reasonable. Roth's response? Alex said, and I'm paraphrasing here because his actual words are a bit more colorful. He said the vitriol that came out of Roth's mouth in that moment was unbelievable. That Roth found the idea offensive, that he completely lost it. The tour was dead on the spot. Think about that. The man couldn't share a stage with a tribute to his deceased bandmate. That's not a creative difference. That's something else entirely. And here's the thing. Alex Van Halen, who is not exactly a small man and is not exactly a patient man, said he had to stop himself from getting physical. That's how bad it got. So, the tour that would have given Van Halen fans one last goodbye never happened, all because one man couldn't set his ego aside for a single moment. Now, I'm curious, do you think Roth ever thinks about that decision? Because I genuinely wonder. Leave that in the comments. Now I want to talk about some of the rivalries and run-ins that people don't always mention when they tell the Eddie Van Halen story, because this wasn't just about internal band drama. Eddie brought his intensity and his chaos to a lot of relationships outside the band, too. Randy Rhoads. If you know your rock history, you know that Randy Rhoads was the other guitar prodigy of that era, the guy playing for Ozzy Osbourne. Classically trained, technically brilliant, with a style completely different from Eddie's, but every bit as jaw-dropping. There was a rivalry there. Competitive? Absolutely. Each camp had their loyalists. Guitar magazines would pit them against each other, and both of them knew it. The tragedy, of course, is that Randy Rhoads died in a plane crash in 1982. He was only 25 years old, and there's always been this lingering sadness about what might have been. What would those two have done if they'd been given decades to compete with each other, push each other, maybe even collaborate? We'll never know. Motley Crue. Okay, this one is just genuinely chaotic, and I love it for that. When Van Halen toured with Motley Crue, it was basically two parties on wheels. Both bands were living hard, playing hard, and the combination was, let's say, eventful. Stories from that era read like they were written by someone who was definitely not sober when they wrote them. On-stage rivalries, backstage nonsense, the kind of rock and roll excess that seems incredible in retrospect and probably wasn't great for anyone's health in the moment. Eddie was already deep in his addiction by this point, and being surrounded by that environment didn't exactly help. That's an important detail we'll come back to. Rush. This one is almost funny if it weren't kind of sad. At one point, Van Halen was supposed to tour with Rush, two of the most technically gifted bands of their era, on the same bill. Sounds incredible on paper, right? What actually happened was a mess of miscommunication, clashing expectations, and the kind of tour management disasters that make you understand why bands have lawyers. It never really went smoothly, and the relationship between the camps soured pretty quickly. Fred Durst. And then there's this one, which goes from zero to extremely intense in about 5 seconds. Fred Durst. Limp Bizkit frontman, early 2000s, you remember him, had some kind of confrontation with Eddie that escalated to a level nobody expected. We're talking about a situation that allegedly involved a firearm. I know. You think you know the wildest Eddie Van Halen story, and then that comes up. The details are murky, and both sides have different versions of what happened. But the point is, Eddie, especially during his worst years, was not the laid-back guitar genius the guitar magazines wanted you to believe. He was unpredictable, he was volatile, and the people around him often had no idea which version of him they were going to get. Which brings us to the part of this story that I think is the most important and the most honest, the addiction. Eddie Van Halen started drinking and smoking when he was 12. 12! He was Dutch, it was a different era, different cultural norms, but still, that's a long relationship with substances. And as fame arrived, it got worse, not better. By the peak of Van Halen's success, Eddie was in serious trouble. Alcohol, cocaine, you name it. And here's what's really cruel about addiction in the context of genius. For a while, it doesn't seem to matter. The work is still there. The shows are still incredible. Everyone around you sort of enables it because the output is still good. But it catches up. It always catches up. Sammy Hagar came in when Roth left, and by all accounts, those early years with Hagar were actually productive and creatively interesting. They made some solid music. But as Eddie's addiction deepened, the working relationship crumbled. Hagar has been pretty open about this over the years. Watching someone you're supposed to be in a band with slowly deteriorate is brutal. You're trying to make music, and your partner is somewhere else entirely. By the time Eddie had health scares, cancer diagnoses, and the physical toll of decades of hard living catching up with him, the band was essentially in free fall. Multiple lineup changes, a reputation that had shifted from greatest rock band alive to what happened to those guys. And through all of it, the chaos, the fallouts, the betrayals, one person kept showing up: his son. Wolfgang Van Halen. Eddie's relationship with his son Wolfgang is genuinely one of the most moving parts of this whole story. Wolfgang started playing bass for Van Halen in 2006, replacing Michael Anthony, which, caused its own controversy among fans. But more than the music, Wolfgang was watching his father, and at some point, he'd had enough of watching. There came a moment, reportedly intense, uncomfortable, the kind of conversation that takes everything you've got to have, where Wolfgang confronted his father directly about his drinking, his behavior, the person he was becoming. Not from a place of anger, but from a place of, I love you too much to watch this continue. That confrontation was a turning point. Eddie got sober. Not immediately, not perfectly, that's not how recovery works, but he committed to it. And in the years that followed, something shifted. He reconnected with people. He repaired relationships that had seemed permanently broken. Sammy Hagar, they reconciled. The bitterness faded. He was reportedly working toward reconnecting with Michael Anthony too, talking about a reunion that would have brought everyone back together. A tour that would have been a celebration of everything Van Halen ever was. And then the cancer came back. Eddie Van Halen died in October 2020 at 65 years old. A stroke, complications from the cancer he'd been fighting for years. The reunion never happened. The reconciliation with Anthony was never quite complete, and the world lost a guitar player who will genuinely never be replaced. Not because we haven't found someone technically capable, but because Eddie Van Halen was a specific feeling, a combination of instinct, creativity, and raw musicality that doesn't come around very often. Now, if you've made it this far, and I really appreciate you sticking with it, this one's a lot, I want to ask you something. Do you think Eddie knew, in the end, how much damage had been done? And do you think he made peace with it? Because reading through everything, the accounts from his brother Alex, from Sammy Hagar, from the people who were closest to him in those final years, it feels like he was trying, really trying. Sobriety has a way of making the past very clear and very heavy all at once. Eddie didn't have enough time to fix everything, but by all most accounts,
He was genuinely trying.
Hey, real quick, if you're finding this kind of deep dive valuable, this is exactly what we do here at Hidden Fame Files. The stories behind the stories, the stuff that gets buried under the legend. If that's your thing, hit that like button and subscribe right now because we've got more of these coming and you do not want to miss them. Genuinely, it means a lot and it keeps us going. And also, if you didn't know YouTube has a hype button now, tap it for this video if you're enjoying it. It's a newer feature that actually helps smaller channels get discovered, and every tap genuinely makes a difference. So if this one hit right for you, show some love with the hype button. We'll see it. We appreciate it. Okay, back to it. The legacy of Eddie Van Halen is complicated, and I think that's okay to say. Actually, I think it's important to say. Because the narrative that gets told about rock legends, especially ones who die youngish or who die after a long illness, tends to smooth out all the rough edges. Everybody becomes a saint. Everybody becomes uncomplicated. The hardships become struggles, and the betrayals become mistakes. And suddenly, we're left with a very clean, very inaccurate version of a real human being. Eddie Van Halen was extraordinary. Full stop. If you never saw him play live, if you never had the experience of hearing Eruption for the first time and understanding that what you were hearing was genuinely unlike anything that had ever existed before, that's a real loss. But he was also flawed. He hurt people who deserved better. He made choices under the influence of addiction that damaged relationships that mattered. He was capable of great loyalty and of great selfishness, sometimes at the same time. Michael Anthony deserved better. The man gave 30 years of his life to a band and was quietly pushed to the margins. The fact that he couldn't even get a proper goodbye says more than any interview ever could. Sammy Hagar, whatever you think of him as the Van Halen frontman, and fans are still divided on that, by the way, was dealt a difficult hand. He came into a situation already complicated by Eddie's addiction, tried to make it work for nearly 2 decades, and ultimately left with his own set of scars. David Lee Roth, well, Roth is a whole other case. The man is still out there, still performing, still being exactly as unpredictable as he's always been. Whether he has any private regrets about refusing to honor Eddie's memory in that proposed reunion, that's between him and whoever he talks to at 3 in the morning. And Wolfgang Van Halen is out here doing the hard work. He's got his own band now, Mammoth, WVH. He's making his own music. He carries his father's legacy with him, not as a tribute act, but as a real artist trying to figure out what his own voice is, while everyone around him is waiting to hear his dad. That can't be easy, and based on everything I've seen from him, he's handling it with more grace than most people would. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to, and I think it's the takeaway from this whole story. Genius does not excuse cruelty, but it also doesn't erase it. Eddie Van Halen changed music. He changed what was possible on a guitar. He gave millions of people, including a lot of people watching this right now, a soundtrack to their lives that they will carry forever. And he also left behind a trail of hurt people, burned bridges, and missed opportunities for reconciliation that time eventually made permanent. Both of those things are true at the same time, and that's the real story. Not the god on the guitar, not the villain behind the scenes, but a human being, flawed, brilliant, struggling, loving, destructive, and ultimately trying, who ran out of time to finish what he started. The Best of All Worlds tour that Sammy Hagar put together in 2024 with Michael Anthony, Joe Satriani, and Jason Bonham was for a lot of fans the closest thing to a proper goodbye, a celebration of the music, even if the man himself was gone. Alex Van Halen's memoir, Brothers, which came out in late 2024, is worth your time if you want the full picture. It's honest, it's emotional, and it doesn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. And there are apparently vaulted, unfinished Van Halen recordings that might eventually see the light of day, along with a biopic in the works. So, the story isn't entirely over. But the man is, and there's no changing that. If this video hit differently for you, if it made you think about Eddie in a way you hadn't before, or made you feel something about the people in his orbit? I want to hear about it in the comments. Who do you think paid the biggest price for Eddie Van Halen's genius? Was it Michael Anthony, who gave decades and never got his proper goodbye?
Sammy Hagar, who spent years in a band with someone who was fighting a war inside his own head? Was it Wolfgang, who had to grow up carrying all of this? Or, and this is the one I find myself sitting with the most, was it Eddie himself? Because the man who could make a guitar sound like nothing else on earth couldn't quite figure out how to keep the people who loved him from slipping away. And in the end, I think he knew it, and I think it cost him more than any of us will ever really know. This is Hidden Fame Files. We tell the stories that get buried under the legend. If you want more, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit the like button, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and go listen to Eruption today. Just do it. You'll thank me.